I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker, Laura Kriska, today. Laura was born in Japan and moved here to Columbus with her family when she was 2 years old to Grandview Heights. I've watched her career now for 35 years, and I've always marked that her career began the summer after her sophomore year at Denison, when Laura was hired as a lifeguard at the brand new Watson Sports Center at Honda of America Manufacturing. While working as a lifeguard, she observed that our executive vice president, Mr. Shige Yoshida, who some of you may remember spoke to our club 2 years ago on how Honda came to Marysville, he would come over there to swim. And they got to talking because she was going back to Japan as an exchange student the next year at Waseda University. When Laura graduated from Denison, Mr. Yoshida hired her and then put her through a very considerable orientation at Ham, working in welding, paint, assembly. And then she went off to Japan, where Laura went to work at the Honda Motor Company headquarters in the Secretariat. That was the offices where all of the Honda officers and directors, some 40 men, had their desks. And the secretary, the women in the Secretariat, 11 of them, took care of them. Laura, I think, was the first American ever to have that experience of working in a Japanese company on a daily basis with the senior leadership of the company. A few years later, that experience would result in her first book, The Accidental Office Lady, published in 1997, still in print today, that recounts her experiences at Honda. She would come back, continue to work for Honda some, teach school briefly, part-time at Dublin High School, teaching Japanese. She would then go to work for Bobby Rahal's racing team to help them when they were selected as the team to receive Honda's first IndyCar engine. She still had a yen to write, though, so she went off to Columbia University, got a master's in fine arts, and wrote her first book, The Accidental Office Lady. That led to a career in consulting because she had seen what happens when you have people working in a company that come from completely different cultures. And for more than 20 years now, she has consulted with a wide variety of companies, many of them Japanese companies, but now all kinds of companies, I think on 4 different continents, regarding how to bring all the people from different cultures together so that it becomes a team of people who think of themselves as we. And it is a team where the cultures strengthen the company and do not weaken the teamwork and respect. That led to her second book, for which I believe the official publication date is tomorrow. A book written during summers when she would visit. Much of it was written in the Grandview Library. And that book is The Business of We. I think it's a very important book because more and more in our global economy, companies have workforces that come from many different cultures. And Laura has laid out a roadmap for how to get everybody working together as a we team. Let me introduce our speaker, Laura Kriska, here from her home in Brooklyn, New York.
Wow, thank you, Scott. That was wonderful. And thank you to the Columbus Rotary for inviting me to speak. Thank you to Mr. Yoshida, who's here, and my parents are also here today. I feel so excited to be sharing with you about my book the day before it's published. I have worked on this book. I had the idea 10 years ago, and it's just very exciting to be able to share this with you today. Since the pandemic, like many of you, I've been working from home, and I'm going to be trying a technology that I've been using. And I have found that using technology can sometimes be difficult, but sometimes, let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go. Actually, sometimes it can be kind of cool. So I want to try to leverage our virtual situation so that we can still interact in certain ways. And one of those ways of interacting is going to be using the chat function today during this little presentation. I hope that I actually would like to practice it right now. So I think most of you are probably familiar with using the chat function in Zoom. So if you are not, you can go to the bottom of your screen and there is an icon labeled chat. And if you can find that and just type in the city where you're located now. I'm pretty sure most of the people joining are in Columbus, but this is practice because I'm going to ask for a little feedback as I share a little bit about the book. So let's just take about 30 seconds. Let's see if, oh, good, great. Okay, everybody's getting it. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so as Scott described, my career started off in Tokyo working for Honda. I feel so lucky that I got a chance to start my career in Honda Motor Company, where people care so much about their jobs, about working together. I have felt mentored from early days when I knew very little. But one thing I've noticed at Honda and every organization I've ever been part of is that there are us versus them dynamics. Often it's related to the business mandate. Independent of what company it is, there are always these kind of us versus them dynamics. But it's not limited only to business. I think many of us, as all of you were kind of saying earlier about the generational gap, this is definitely an us versus them gap. I think many of us experience. I know I do. And here's one I think everyone on this call can absolutely relate to. Us versus them. So sometimes us versus them dynamics are rather inconsequential. And I'm going to ask now for you to use the chat function. And so you can type in any example of an us versus them dynamic that either you have experienced or perhaps you have observed. It could be something quite serious, or it could be something kind of inconsequential. So let's take a moment, again, using the chat function to write in some type of us versus them dynamic. And I'm going to just take a look. So we see, yes, the merger and acquisition culture. This is a classic situation where we have two organizations coming together, management versus non-management, mask versus not mask. Now that's a very important one. Denison versus Canyon. Hey, who said that? Doug, okay. I don't know if you're on my team or not. Very good. So as we look at this list, we can see that they fall into three categories of severity. We have situations that I would describe as inconsequential, where there's not long-term meaningful outcomes. And then we have issues like consequential and game-changing. I think the example of the mask wearing versus non-mask wearing is extremely consequential for people here in the United States. And we can see where the us versus them dynamic has had a terrible impact because we're not all on the same team. This is a situation with the virus that clearly a we approach would help us. There really should be no argument about mask versus non-mask. This should be a simple tug of war, humans versus virus. So this idea of us versus them has been something I've thought about a lot in my career. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experience at Honda in Japan, but I want to talk about the idea of this book that I've just written in it. And so 2 years ago, I did a TEDx talk here in New York, and it helped me formalize my ideas of what needs to happen when we have us versus them dynamics. And I've come up with this idea of we building. We building. We building is a deliberate action. It's actively closing any us versus them gap in order to improve teamwork, safety, trust, communication, all of these kind of things. And I like to describe why this is important in using this very simple idea, trust. Everybody who's joining on this call today understands that when we start a new relationship, it follows a continuum, right? We start off as strangers, we get acquainted, we get to colleague, and the goal is to get to trusted colleague level. When we have deep, resilient relationships that are based on trust, we can solve many problems. But the thing that I have discovered in my own life, and as I have observed thousands of other people, is that when there is some difference in a person's culture, meaning not only their nationality, but maybe they have a language difference, but it goes far beyond that. It could be a difference in generation, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, any type of perceived barrier that people get stuck here. They easily go from stranger, acquaintance, colleague, fine, but getting to the trusted colleague category seems hard. Now, when people are interacting with those who they perceive are very similar to them, it seems a lot easier that they get from this colleague to trusted colleague. So the barrier is here, from colleague to trusted colleague, especially with people who seem different in some way. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. People's names. When I was growing up in Grandview, and I went to First Community Church, a lot of kids from Upper Arlington, names like Scott and Laura were very common. And when you grow up in a cultural majority where people share similar names, when they look like you, when you identify with the people who are leading the community, it's kind of easy to call people by their certain name and have people remember your name. But America is growing more and more diverse. And so I noticed with my kids, I have 3 kids, they have friends whose names are sometimes hard for me to pronounce or remember. We builders put in the effort to make sure they say and learn other people's names, even if they're different. This is a small example of the type of behavior we need so much in our world today. I mean, can you imagine if we lived in a place where people could be different? They could look different, they could pray differently, they could have different ideas about things, but still agreed on enough that they could work together, where instead of having lawyers fighting out situations in court, they could be using their brilliance to solve big problems that we all have, business leaders, elected officials. What if these people were working together based on facts and seeing each other, seeing the differences that we inevitably have, and working together, not letting these differences cause some difficulty. This is the kind of world I like to imagine. I think, we have so many issues that are common problems: climate change, poverty, hunger. These are the issues I'd rather see people working toward together. So one of the things that I have discovered in my experience of thinking about this topic is that everyone has felt like a them at some point in their lives. Sometimes it's very situational and passing, but for other people, feeling like a them is a way of life. It's a daily issue. So I want to share a little bit. I'm going to move myself around. I was a them when I went to Tokyo to work for Honda Motor Company. I worked with a lovely group of office ladies. As Scott mentioned, I was the first American woman to work in the Tokyo headquarters. I had great experiences. This is Mr. Honda. And I'll give you a close-up picture of that. And this is how long ago it was. Very long time ago. And then, as Scott mentioned, this is the book I wrote about working for Honda. But I really spent my time working with the office ladies. We served tea, we cleaned ashtrays, and we worked, and we all wore this uniform you can see here. I'll move myself out of the way. This was a women's only uniform. I was not too fond of it, but I was the visitor, so that's what I wore. And during the time, I got to know these two women in particular. We traveled together, we had lunch together, I had a Halloween party. And what happened is that I started to move along this trust continuum with people who were very different from me. And over time, I got to this level, this trusted colleague level. And because of that, I learned something really important that was going to change my life and change the experience of Honda Motor Company. It's actually true. And it has to do with the uniform. This uniform that was for only women. What I learned is that the women that I was working with also didn't like it. And so together we formed a group. It was using the quality circle mechanism of change inside the company. And we got Japanese women, there was an American man, a French man, and we researched this topic. And after a lot of work, over 2 years of work actually, Honda Motor Company decided to change the policy on women's uniform, and they made it optional. And this was my first experience with WeBuilding before I even knew what to call it. After this, as Scott said, I've spent my career working with many organizations. Now, I know that people on this call have a lot of experience with different cultures and countries. So now I'm going to invite you again, using the chat function. I'd like to see if you could write in other countries and cultures that you have either worked firsthand or perhaps worked with people from those cultures. Let's just take a look in the chat function again. So I see China, the Philippines, Venezuela, Mexico. Yeah, yes, India. Fantastic. And we see Dana saying she was in Texas, far west Texas, where people did not speak English, they spoke Spanish. Very good. Wow, this is quite impressive. Egypt, Tanzania, Ghana. Fantastic. So one of the things that all of you are responding to is this idea of a cultural identity. I'm going to make myself disappear for a moment. I'll make this a little bigger. And when what I first thought was that culture differences were only happened when you got on a plane or you worked with people that had a different passport than you did. But what I've discovered is that culture difference can be related to any aspect of a person's identity. You see on this chart, here are the things that tend to be visible about a person and their cultural identity. This includes things like your age, your physical ability, your gender identity, ethnicity, all of these things. And there are a whole bunch of other items under here that are related to things we cannot see about a person's identity. But any one of these topics and others can become the basis of an us versus them dynamic. And I got a real sense of this when I came back to the United States, and I got a job working for Bobby Rahal right here in Ohio. And I actually found out that I could use we building. Again, I didn't call it we building at the time, but helped Bobby Rahal and his team win the Indy 500 using we building. So I want to tell you that story. As Scott said, Honda had been very successful in Formula One racing, and they wanted to get into Indy racing. So in 1993, they made a one-year agreement with Bobby Rahal. And the agreement loosely was something like this. Bobby Rahal would provide the chassis and about 10 American guys and a driver. And from Japan, Honda would send about 10 engineers, a bunch of spec engines that they would test over the period of the year. Now, I was part of this team. I was kind of the translator for the team. I did some support work. And this program started in January of 1993. And the Japanese team would be arriving in February. So I visited the garage for the first time. And I had been around cars, having worked for Honda, but I'd never been around racers and racing teams. And I had a little bit of a shock, I'll tell you. The people in the garage were very loud and big, and they talked really fast. And it occurred to me that communication was going to be an important topic when these two groups of men were going to get together to work together. The guys in the garage, Bobby Rahal's team, I affectionately referred to them as the gearheads, because they loved cars. They knew everything there was to know about cars. And after getting to know them and knowing that the Japanese team would be arriving within a few weeks, I said to Bobby Rahal, I would like to teach Japanese to the gearheads. My goal was that on the day that the Japanese team arrived, that the gearheads would introduce themselves in Japanese. One of the reasons I suggested this is that the gearheads are from Ohio. They were the home team. And I believe that when there is a dominant culture in any place, that there are advantages to that. They're the home team. They know how things work. They speak the language, etc. And so as the home team, I wanted Bobby Rahal's gearheads to make a gesture. So he agreed. For a couple weeks. We practiced every day at lunch. And then the day arrived. The Japanese team arrived at the Columbus airport. We got the call. They're coming straight to the garage. It was about 5 o'clock at night. And the gearheads were nervous. Bobby Rahal was not with us. He was on a racing team. We were a separate location. We were the research team. The leader of our group was a guy named Dennis. Dennis was a very tall man, crew cut. He had been in the military, just kind of imposing. And it was going to be Dennis's job to start off our introductions in Japanese. So the team gets to the office, the team from Japan, they walk in and they are standing in a kind of half circle. We, the gearheads, are all standing in a corresponding half circle. And Dennis steps forward and he says, Boku wa Dennis desu, dozo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. It's Japanese. It's not very well pronounced, but it was Japanese. And the Japanese engineers were like, what just happened? And then the next gearhead steps up. Boku wa Steve desu, dozo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. And one after another, they all did it. And the last guy on the gearhead team was a young man named Joe, very smart, but just couldn't grasp languages very easily. And Joe had one phrase that I called his default phrase that he would say in a kind of moment of panic. And his phrase was, Ohayo gozaimasu. For those of you who are familiar, you might know, it's 6 o'clock at night and Joe steps in front of everyone and says, Ohayo gozaimasu, good morning. And everybody starts laughing, everyone. The Japanese team is laughing, Dennis, Joe, gearheads, I'm laughing because he said good morning. There was this tension in the room at that moment. And that mistake caused something that when I've looked back, I see that as a we moment. The we action of introducing ourselves in Japanese, that was planned, but the mistake wasn't. And it was powerful. I believe in that moment, these two groups of men who looked, sounded, had grown up so differently, different. They lived thousands of miles away from each other. They had different languages, different race, different ethnicities. But in that one moment, they were together, and that carried through the year we worked together. This is a real picture of that team. This was at some racetrack. I don't even remember where it was, but they recognized quite quickly that being they were on the same team. They had one common goal, which was to make a super fast race car. And eventually that's what they did. It took a lot of effort. It was not only We Building that contributed to this, but We Building was a factor, I believe. I'm going to take a little bit of credit. So this was Bobby Rahal's team winning the Indy 500 with Bobby Rice as a driver. And by the way, just recently, Takuma Sato won the Indy 500. It was run, a little bit off schedule this year. But this is the power of We Building. We Building is more than cooperation. It is seeing difference. It's acknowledging that differences exist. It's trying to understand those differences, not agree with them, but understand them, respect them. There are 3 steps in my book. I talk about fostering awareness. This is something Rotarians already know. You understand that this exists. And then there are cultural self-assessment and the gap closing action plan. The cultural self-assessment is particularly important. There are 10 questions in my book that I believe can fundamentally transform a person's understanding of themselves and therefore the people around them. Now, it's my position that it's face-to-face interactions of increasing depth that really are the fundamental path toward creating change in the world. And as I said, Rotarians, you know this, you're an organization, the Rotary itself is a We Building institution. And I know this organization cares a lot about building trust. I want to highlight what I found in my email. I loved this Rotarian I Dare You bingo card. I really like, I'm going to move myself here, especially this kind of idea, sit with somebody different. One day we'll be in person again and hosting, having people who aren't in the club try to, come join. These are the type of actions that I think are really important. So it is my life's work. I want to inspire people to take action. I want to help create a safer, more welcoming and productive world. This really is, this is my life's work. I want to have as many people participate in this kind of exercise as possible. And I cannot do this alone. I need your help, and you are all We Builders already. I'm going to put a link for my buying the book in the chat. I would love it if you buy the book, but there's something even more important that I would like to ask all of you to think about doing, and that is help me share this message. I've learned a lot about social media, and I don't love it. I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't love tweeting and Instagram. I don't know if all of you have followers. But I believe this group of people, how many we have? 61 people today. Many of you, probably all of you, have something that's more important than 1 million followers. And that is you have decades of influence that you've built up in Columbus, Ohio. And if any of you are moved to help me use your influence to share this message, I would love to speak to other groups. You can influence others, and I need that kind of help. So I want to be very sensitive about the time. I hope if you have questions, we can have a little time for that. But as I said, I want to build a we building revolution. Columbus is a place where I always go to get support. My parents, who are on the call today, have helped me be successful. Columbus has helped me in my journey, and I hope that will continue. So thank you, everyone, so much.
Laura, a question. I know we all can sharpen our we-building skills, but share with us where we're going to be able to get your book right away.
Oh, let's see. Thank you for that shout out. Let's see. So the book actually goes on sale. I mean, you can buy it now. But the best place to buy it, I'll put it right here in the chat, is on Amazon. There is another chat through HarperCollins is the publisher. And if you buy it today, I think you'll have it in your Kindle tomorrow. So thank you for that very much.
Laura, this is Dana Vogelmeyer. I have a question for you.
Dana.
Hi. I'm so with you, and I feel like understanding the people that we work with or are in clubs with, we get to that trusted place. And I would see that often in the workplace, and I do consulting as well. But one thing that I love that you talked about was when the person said 6 o'clock in the morning and everyone laughed. You know, it's a little bit endearing, but I think that the effort that everyone showed to learn how to speak their language when they came on the first day was huge. And my question really is, do you see that in time and time again, not just in that situation where people just trying can get you to that trusted place better? You may not do everything exactly right, but if you try to connect with people and try to make an effort, you get over that hurdle a lot faster.
Yes, I agree with you, Dana. It's the effort, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that when we put ourselves out there, we're going to make mistakes. Some of those mistakes can be laughed off and should be laughed off, but others won't. And if you're really going to do some serious we building, you're going to have a little pain. And I think it's incumbent upon people who identify with the majority culture in a particular place to do the work. So when the Japanese visitors were coming to Columbus, it was the gearheads who were in the majority. They're from Columbus, they speak English. So I think for too long, there's been an expectation that the visitor should do all the work, and the visitor should do a lot of work. But when you're on the home team, you have advantages. And the more people can see and recognize that and be generous, I think the better off we're all going to be. Thank you for that great question.
Laura, we have time for one more question. If you want to grab one out of the chat, I can't see it because I'm on my phone.
Okay. What is the impact of leadership on we building? Well, I think that it's really up to leaders to model this behavior. Again, I'm going to go back to this idea of a cultural majority. When I think about Japan and some of the organizations that I have worked with in my career, the leaders sometimes don't get on board. And if leaders are not modeling the behavior, a specific example would be when Japanese expatriates come to work outside of Japan, they should be doing things like having lunch together with people who are not Japanese. But I would see leaders only eating with people who were similar, other Japanese men, for example. So if we use that idea for here in the United States, if someone's a leader, and if we're frank about it, you know, in America, it's middle-aged white men who are usually in leadership positions. And so if they are only eating lunch with other people who are similar to them, you know, I'd say, well, could you challenge yourself a little bit? That would be good. And that's a type of modeling for leadership I think all of us could learn from.
Great. If you are open to it, if you want to drop your contact info into the chat, and if people have additional questions and want to continue the conversation, that would be wonderful, if that's okay with you.
Yes, and I really do welcome suggestions on groups that I can talk to, corporate groups. I've talked to church groups, civic groups. I'm very interested in promoting these ideas to as many people as possible. And so thank you.
Wonderful. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you guys then. Thank you so much. Ring that bell, Scott.